Hello there. I assume you are here because you want to lead some Jehovah's Witnesses into the true kingdom of Jehovah. If you haven't yet done so, I suggest that you watch my two introductory videos, Reaching Jehovah's Witnesses in Love, where I give some hints on how to lovingly help Jehovah's Witnesses find Jesus as their Savior. And the links obviously are down below in the description. Another assumption that I made is that you have already had your first meeting with the Jehovah's Witnesses and that they have agreed to your three conditions. Number one, that you will meet with them for at least 10 or 15 times. Number two, that the very same people will come each time, and this is very important as I explained in the introductory videos. And number three, that you will study together the Gospel of John. You want to understand their organization better, and in the meantime, you'll ask a few questions about how they interpret the Bible and how they view Jesus. I also assume that in the first meeting, you promise them to give them some questions from the Gospel of John. Maybe you mailed or emailed those questions to them, or maybe they visited you in the meantime and you gave them the questions. It's up to you really, but please hand them the questions for John chapter 1 so that they have time to prepare. You don't want them to say, well, I don't know. Give them time to prepare. And I suggest that you give them these questions before the first meeting, before you study the first chapter of John, but not in the first meeting. Even if you have the questions ready, it's better to say, hey, I'm going to mail or email the questions to you. Why? Because this way you could have their contact details. If later on you ask some questions and they don't know how to answer and they want to stop coming to you, at least you can contact them and see what's going on. This you can get in touch with them. Now, if my assumptions are correct, then this study of John chapter 1 is the second meeting you have with them. John 1 is probably one of the most disputed chapters between Jehovah's Witnesses and Christians. When you study with Jehovah's Witnesses, you might be tempted to bash them with all the proofs that you find in John chapter 1 that Jesus is indeed God. Now, you can't do that. But is that wise? You see, bringing a Jehovah's Witness into Jehovah's true kingdom may take a long time. Rather than crushing them with all the evidence, why not kindly ask some questions that will make them think? There are plenty of places in the Gospel of John where you can press your point home, but I don't think that John chapter 1 is one of them. More than that, do you really love Jehovah's Witnesses? Do you love these two people sat in front of you? So how about you spend a few meetings where you just ask questions and accept any answer? I know that's difficult, but just accept any answer. How about you don't argue back? How about you just take notes, just sit down, listen to what they have to say, take notes. It is very important to show that you are interested in this conversation, that you are not there to bash them. You want to have a civilized conversation. Take notes. And later on, you can come back to your notes and ask any questions that were left unanswered when you discussed that chapter. As I have already mentioned in the introductory videos, please use their translation of the Bible. As I said, there is a 1984 version, there is a 2013 version, and the 2013 version also comes as a study edition. I suggest you use that one, as there are a lot of notes there. There are many references in there, and that's really good to understand their thinking about that particular verse. Also, you can find a Greek-English interlinear, which is called the Kingdom Interlinear. That will come very handy a bit later. And even if you don't know much Greek, you will see how useful that tool can be. Now, before I start with the questions from John chapter 1, do you remember what your purpose is? Your purpose is to show them that Watchtower is not trustworthy. That is your main purpose in this study. You need to ask questions that will help them doubt that the organization is truly God's only channel of communication with humanity. This course is organized in such a way so that at times you ask questions about their organization. They have some dirty secrets, and many Jehovah's Witnesses are not even aware of them. In due time, I'll point you to those secrets as well as what material you may be able to use. When you prepare the questions, remember Kukul's Colombo tactic? If you haven't yet watched one of Kukul's videos, I suggest you stop now and watch so that you understand what this is all about. And if you haven't watched any episodes to see Lieutenant Colombo doing his job, what world do you live in? Just joking. But seriously. So, here are some of my questions that I asked my Jehovah's Witnesses friends when I studied with them. As you ask these questions, you will soon discover that they have answers. They will probably quickly search jw.org and find the answers. So I want you to be patient and think of how you can show them the inconsistencies. What questions can you ask to help them think? By the way, you will find these questions that I'm asking in my blog, and if you look below in the description box, you will find a link to my blog. The way these questions are organized, you will see that certain questions are marked with numbers and others are marked with letters. The questions that are marked with numbers, they are in bold. These are the questions that you need to give them beforehand. The other questions are follow-up questions. You might not even be able to ask those questions, but once you've asked the main questions, they give you the answer. Based on that answer, you could go ahead and ask some follow-up questions. So, what is the first question that you may be able to ask? The first question is this. There are many commentaries out there produced by other denominations where they explain the Gospel of John verse by verse. Is there a Bible commentary produced by Watchtower where they analyze the Gospel of John verse by verse? Now, what is the purpose of this question? It is meant to be an icebreaker. There is no right or wrong answer here. If Watchtower have produced such a Bible commentary, fine. If they haven't produced one, fine. But it's an icebreaker, and yet it's a bit more than an icebreaker. As you can see, it's a question about the organization. Remember that you said that you want to understand the organization a bit better, and now you are asking a question about the organization, but you are doing so in a non-threatening way. You are just curious. You want to know. I personally don't know the answer to this question. If they have produced such a commentary, fine. If they haven't produced one, maybe why? I don't know. But this is an interesting question to start with. 2. Are there Bible studies at your Kingdom Hall or maybe in groups where you study the Gospel of John chapter by chapter? As you can see, this is again an icebreaker. This question is very similar to the previous question, in which you try to understand Jehovah's Witness practices. If there is such a study, fine. If there isn't one, fine again. But obviously, if there isn't such a verse-by-verse study, why not? You may want to follow this with a question. Are there other studies where you take a book of the Bible and you study it chapter by chapter and verse by verse? Again, I don't know the answer, but it's an interesting question to understand their culture and how they study the Bible. Question number 3. Would you be able to tell me in broad terms what John's purpose was when he wrote this gospel? Now, this sounds a bit like a more difficult question, but if you gave them the questions beforehand, that means they had time to do their homework. And what it happens if you go to jw.org and type Gospel of John Purpose, you might end up to this page where they actually explain what the purpose is. Underlined there says that John states his purpose for writing the account he was led by inspiration to write, in which he repeated little that had been written before. But these have been written down that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that because of believing you may have life by means of his name. As you can see, you already have the the answer here. So when you ask this question, hopefully this is the response they will give. Now, if they couldn't find an answer to this question, or maybe they gave you a different answer, you can just navigate to this page when they visit you, show them this and just say, I searched for on your website for this phrase and this page came up. Would you say that this is John's purpose? It's very important to decide what John's purpose is, because later questions will be linked to this. 4. I think it's easier to understand something when it's presented in a condensed form. So could you summarize this chapter for me? You see, each time for each chapter you will ask them to summarize it for you. You'd like to summarize it because when they summarize this chapter, they will have to think about what the chapter means. They'll have to think for themselves. You see, if you ask questions about one verse, they could just go do a search of that verse, see what Watchtower said about that verse, and then give you the answer. But when they have to summarize a whole chapter, they have to think about it, and that is very important. Next question is about John 1:1. If you are a Christian, you are maybe shocked or maybe even angered when you read their translation of John 1:1. It says that the Word was a God. You have a God, the article a, indefinite article a, and you have the small g. So ask this question. All translations that I'm aware of translate John 1:1 differently. For example, King James has it that the Word was God. Why is it different in your translation? By the way, if you are using their 2013 version, you will see that on the right-hand side, you can find other translations, including King James. So you can just show that this is one of the translations that kind of they approve of. So you pointed John chapter 1, verse 1 in King James, that is different from the New World Translation. So when you ask this question, I don't know exactly what their answer will be, but it's most likely something about this being the best translation of the Greek text. Now, of course, that's nonsense. It's just not true. They even quoted Greek scholars who they said supported their translation, but then the Greek scholars themselves refuted that in videos that they produced, and they said, no, that's not true. So if they say this is the best translation of the Greek, do not argue with them. You might be an expert of Greek, or maybe just you watched experts explaining how this is wrong, but don't argue here. Later on, when we study together John chapter 20, and especially Thomas and the confession of faith that he makes, it's there when we will discuss a bit the Greek language. Again, you don't have to be an expert of Greek. Everything will be there, and you'll see that everything will make sense. So please don't argue here. Just listen to their answer and thank them for that. Write it down and keep it for later. Question number 6. Who are the translators of the New World Translation, and what are their qualifications? Are they Greek professors or scholars? Right? As far as I know, they kept the New World Translation anonymous. And they say, well, we do not want to publish the names of the translators because we want all praise to go to God. If you publish their names, then they will get the glory. And that's nonsense. I mean, why would they get the glory? I think that what they are trying to do here is to hide the fact that actually none of them was actually a Greek scholar, and none of them was a professor or a scholar of Greek. So, if that's the answer that they give, you might want to follow up with a question. Wouldn't it be better for the translators to be made public so that their level of scholarship could be assessed? Right? You don't try to corner them with this question, just out of genuine interest. By the way, wouldn't it be nice if they made public the list of translators so that we can see what their level of Greek knowledge is, what their qualifications are? You see, Watchtower seems to be quite fond of using little stories. I have read quite a lot of their literature, and I noticed something quite sad in a sense, but what happens when they introduce a doctrine that has absolutely no biblical grounds? What they do, in the beginning of the article, they give you a well-crafted story. And based on that story, they go like, well, it makes sense that this doctrine follows. But that doctrine is not based on the Bible. It's based on the story that they produced. So you could use their methodology and give them an illustration. The illustration could be something like this. Imagine you need brain surgery. Who would you like to operate on you? You'd like the best expert in the field if possible. What if an IT guy wanted to perform the operation? They opened computers before and they fixed all of them. Your brain is pretty much like a computer, so what's the big fuss? No, you wouldn't want an IT guy to operate on you, no matter how good they are in their field. You need a brain surgeon. So wouldn't it be fair for Watchtower to give the list of the translators so that we can make sure that they are experts in the Greek language and that we can trust their work? Right? An illustration that makes a point. We need to make sure that the people who operate on our brain, they are brain surgeons. We need to make sure that the people who operate on our hearts with the Bible, they know what they are doing. So, I suggest these are all the questions you ask about John 1:1. Now, I'm convinced that you may want to explain to them that their understanding of Greek is wrong, or maybe you want to tell them that this translation is wrong and that they use the translation of Johannes Grieber to support their point, how they translated John 1:1. Yet John Grieber produced his translation with the help of demons. Now, trust me, later on in the study, we will touch these points, but this is just chapter 1. This is your second meeting with them, and if you start a war with them at this point, it will be very difficult to build bridges. So just ask questions, listen for their answers, and then move on. Now, the next question is based on verse 3, John chapter 1, verse 3. Please take a pen and paper and divide the page into 2 columns. In the first column, write not created. In the second column, write created. Now ask the next question. All reality can be divided into 2 types of things or beings, not created and created. Where would you put God? Where would you put stars, angels, animals, and humans? Where would you put Jesus? Now, it is very likely that they would put God under not created and everything else under created. Now, us as Christians, we believe that Jesus was not created because Jesus is God. But for them, Jesus is the first creation of God, Jehovah, and that through Jesus, he created everything else. So Jesus will end up under created. But if they put Jesus under created, then that doesn't quite make sense. So you may follow up with this question. In verse 3, it says, all things came into existence through him, and apart from him, not even one thing came into existence. This means that absolutely everything under created were created by Jesus. Since you put Jesus under created, it means that Jesus created himself. It means that Jesus created Jesus. Now, don't think that you have cornered them. Indeed, I strongly discourage you from trying to corner them. Later on in the course, you may press them for an answer, but this is not the place. Just take notes of their answer and then move on. Just let the Holy Spirit do his work in them. Now, I don't know what they will answer to this, but most likely they will say that Jesus created all other things. They may even quote Colossians chapter 1, verses 15 to 20, and you will see that in their translation, it actually says that Jesus created all other things. Now, if they want to go there, just thank them and say, well, before we go to Colossians, could we focus a bit more what John said? John said that all things came into existence through him, and apart from him, not even one thing came into existence. So John is trying to make a point that absolutely nothing came into existence without Jesus. Absolutely all things under created came through Jesus. So should we just ignore what John says here? Remember again that this is just the first meeting. Promise them that you will look into any text that they suggest now, and later on you will discuss them. Actually, when we study John chapter 4, I'll show you that Colossians chapter 1 verses 15 through 20, these verses have been altered in their translation, and the word other was introduced in there. The word is not in Greek. So this is a good point where we are going to use the kingdom interlinear. Again, don't worry if you do not know Greek. You have the Greek words in there, and under each Greek word you have the translation. So when you look at even a translation in English, the word other does not exist there. Also, I'll mention 1 Corinthians 8:6, where even their translation says that through Jesus all things were created. All things, not all other things. So for now, just thank them for their answers, and promise you will look into these issues a bit later. So these are the questions for chapter 1. You should be able to go through them in one sitting, but even if you can't, even if it takes longer, do not worry, you can split them into 2 meetings. That's not a problem. Now, what do you think? Are you underwhelmed? Are you disappointed? Did you expect that I would take out all the heavy artillery and start hitting them with all the arguments in chapter 1 that Jesus is God? If that's the case, then remember that the main aim of this course is for you to build relationships with them and help them break free from under the spell of Watchtower. You want to build a relationship with them. If you start a war with them in chapter 1, it will be hard to build a relationship with them. As for the important theological points that I missed intentionally in chapter 1, I promise that I will pick up on them later on in the Gospel of John, and we will return to chapter 1 quite a few times to point at a few things, as I said, but it's later on during the study. Please watch the other videos in the series and you will see for yourself. Now, before I finish, could I ask that if you are a Jehovah's Witness and you think I have misrepresented Watchtower teachings, please put your comments in the chat with links to any JW library materials. Don't just say I disagree with that as a Jehovah's Witness, but rather point me to the right articles produced by Watchtower, and I'm happy to address any things that I said wrong. Also, if you are a Christian and have tried this course, please let me know how it went. Did it make sense? Could you use it? Did it help you? What were their answers? And so on. And if you have any suggestions on how to improve this course, please let me know. And if you found this course valuable, please like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell. And if you think that other people might benefit from it, please share it with them. And remember, those Jehovah's Witnesses sat in front of you, they are not the enemy. They just work for him. God bless.